Do we still have Dr. Longley and Dr. Peterson on the line?
I'm here.
I'm here.
Great.
What was all that about?
It was a wrong number.
Oh, hello, can you hear me?
Hi, who's on the line?
Oh, this is Joshua Luke from Division of Financial Assistance. I thought I had this conference booked at 10, but let me double check my info. You guys believe you have it booked at 10? 10 to 11?
We have it booked from 10 to 3.
Okay. All right, let me double check my info if I got the wrong number written down. Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, Carl, this is Clay. I think we may get a couple interruptions because it appears that somebody from State Board booked the same conference line that we had reserved.
Not a problem. Okay.
We'll get started here in just a moment.
Are you still there?
Yeah, we're gonna start in a couple minutes.
Okay. It just got really quiet, so I was afraid I'd lost you.
No, we're still here.
Okay, I guess we will go ahead and get started. So I'm really missing having our facilitator, so I guess again I will get to do that. I want to welcome everybody to our food safety expert panel to discuss issues associated with the application of oil field produced water to crops for human consumption. So anyway, we'll start some introductions. I'll go ahead and then we'll go to the panel members, other regional board staff, our science expert. So I'll start. I'm Clay Rogers. I'm an assistant executive officer with the Central Valley Water Board.
Just lost you, Clay. Are you close to the microphone?
Oh, I'm sorry. What part did I cut out, Carl?
You started to introduce yourself, then it went blank.
Okay, well, I'll do it again for the people on the phone. My name's Clay Rogers. I'm the Assistant Executive Officer with the Central Valley Water Board in the Fresno office, and we'll go to Bruce Mackler in the panel.
I'm Bruce Mackler with US EPA's Drinking Water Program. Currently, I'm on loan to the State Water Board's Drinking Water Program.
Stephen Beam with the California Department of Food and Agriculture.
Seth Shonkoff, PSE, and UC Berkeley and LBNL.
Dave Mazzara, I'm with the California Department of Public Health. I'm over the food, drug, and cosmetic programs. We also oversee cannabis safety now, and pleasure to be here.
Andy Gorders with the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Fresno.
Mark Jones with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I'm supposed to say that I'm not here representing the Army. So.
Josh Mahoney with the Water Board in Fresno.
Rebecca Asami, Central Valley Water Board.
Will Stringfellow with Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. I'm serving as science advisor.
This is Barbara Peterson with Exponent.
Carl Longley, Central Valley Water Board.
R.J. Salcido, Central Valley Water Board.
Go ahead. We won't introduce all of the guests, but we do have a couple people from the consultants who are doing the work. GSI, Rob and Bernie, if you want to introduce yourself.
That on? I'm Rob Schofield from GSI Environmental. We're the consultants working on the project.
I'm Bernie Beckerman from GSI Environmental.
With that, we'll anybody else on the phone that's on the panel or associated with the water board? Hearing none, we'll go ahead and Rebecca, you want to talk about the January 24th meeting summary?
Sure. So this meeting summary is for the last public meeting that we held, as Clay said, back in January. It's just a summary. It's not meant to be minutes. This was sent out to the panel, I think earlier this week, or maybe even late last week for a review. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, please do so. Generally what we do with these is we give the panel some time to review it, since a lot of their comments are represented in the summary, and if they okay it, then we post them to our webpage, the food safety webpage. We did get comments back from one panel member, but we'll give you guys some time if you'd like to submit comments later also. How much time do you want to give them?
I was just going to say it would be nice if perhaps we could get your comments in a week, and then we'll go ahead and finish that up and get that posted on the website so that members of the public can take a look at that if they so desire. Does a week sound like enough time for everybody? If not, let us know, and we can probably accommodate a few more days if you've got some specific issue that would prevent that. Hearing none, we'll go ahead and, Rebecca, Josh, you want to talk about updates of waste discharge requirements?
Good morning.
Yeah, we're getting a little feedback in the room from somebody on the phone. If you're not speaking, if you could please be on mute, we would appreciate that greatly. Thank you.
Good morning, panel members, board members, public, and staff. My name is Rebecca Asami, and I am a staff geologist with the Central Valley Water Board. Today, I'm going to discuss an order which was adopted by the board in April. The order affects oil field produced water reclamation projects in Kern and Tulare counties. The adopted order, number R5 2019-0025, amends waste discharge requirements, or WDRs, that allow for the reuse of oil field produced wastewater. This slide shows the WDRs which were amended. They include WDRs for California Resources Production Corporation, North Kern Water Storage District, Hathaway LLC, Kern Tulare Water Storage District, Jasmin Ranchos Mutual Water Company, Coelho Water District, and Chevron USA. During this presentation, I will refer to these entities collectively as dischargers. The adopted order makes changes to the existing orders by requiring the dischargers to be fully engaged in the Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, between the Central Valley Water Board and the dischargers. The MOU defines conditions under which the food safety project studies are conducted. Under the MOU, the manager, who is the AEO of the Fresno office, oversees the technical work which is completed by a third-party consulting firm, GSI Environmental. A copy of the MOU is available on the board's food safety webpage. Thus far, 3 tasks will be completed under the MOU. The first task is to compile a list of chemicals of interest. To complete this task, the consultants have been reviewing a list of naturally occurring constituents, those that might be found in produced water, and a list of constituents from 13267 orders issued to the dischargers in 2018. A draft report on this task has been completed and is available on our website. Task 2 is a literature review. The literature review will be a compilation of information on the chemicals of interest identified in Task 1. My understanding is that the consultants have started completing this task and will focus more on it once the report for Task 1 is final. Task 3 is crop sampling. Crop sampling has been a part of the food safety project since 2017. Crops are sampled by third-party consultants. Central Valley Water Board staff are present during the sampling events and obtain the samples before they are shipped to the laboratory under chain of custody. This year, citrus, cherries, and carrots will be analyzed. Citrus was sampled in February, and cherries were sampled last week. Carrots should be sampled in July. We do not anticipate needing more samples next year unless we get direction from the panel to do so. This slide summarizes the requirements of the order, which was adopted in April. Under the order, which amends the WDR as mentioned previously in this presentation, dischargers must provide information necessary to complete the MOU tasks. This includes information on crops such as harvest windows. The manager may propose an order for consideration by the board that would prohibit the use of produced water for a discharger that does not comply with these new requirements. Anyone interested in reading the order in full can do so by going to the board's adopted orders webpage. This concludes my presentation. Are there any questions from the panel on this new order?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple things. I mean, we put this order in front of the board because we had a couple issues last year where there was some miscommunication. Things didn't get sampled that we thought should be sampled. That included cherries. We missed the window to get them sampled because there was some miscommunication. So we put this order and gave it to all of the folks that are involved in this activity to make absolutely certain that they understood that there would be severe repercussions if they didn't participate and information was missed that needed to be collected. So that was the reason the order was adopted. I'll also add that we had told the panel in January that we would be sampling blueberries also. Blueberries were one of the crops that we thought we had missed. However, in working with the dischargers, it came to light that the blueberries that are grown actually are not irrigated with produced water. They don't use district water that is the source of the produced water. And the blueberries that are grown entirely on well water that's used to irrigate those crops. I also went to the extent that we've asked and will be receiving a document from the blueberry grower that basically certifies under penalty of perjury that he has not used any produced water to irrigate those blueberries, so that we are comfortable that he understands that, this has to be completely truthful. And if he's used any produced water, it needs to be reported so that samples can be collected. So if there's any other questions also, like Rebecca said, we just sampled cherries, so we don't have the results. Bernie's going to talk a little bit about the citrus sampling that was done earlier this year during the citrus season. We have carrots that are left. The plan we talked about on the 24th of January is we don't have any other new crops or root crops that are being grown using produced water. So we want to complete task 1 and task 2, get the white paper out for your consideration and comment on to accurately portray what the panel wants, and then we'll look to see what the recommendation is for additional types of sampling and whether that would include food sampling that needs to be done. But right now, I'm looking that, we'll have a white paper, I hope draft to the panel by the end of the year that basically presents the results. GSI is working on their tasks. They'll be talking about the, I guess it's the task 1 draft report that's been out that has been commented on. We put that up for public review of the draft a few days ago. And so we'll have some more discussion about that today also. I don't know if the panel or any members of the public have any questions about anything so far. I assume there's no questions from anybody on the phone either? Hearing none and seeing none, we'll move on to Bernie from GSI, who can...
We've got one more presentation as well, over here.
Oh, excuse me, I was premature.
Yeah, we got another staff presentation. Also, we had a little mix-up with the conference line. So the people on the conference line, this is Josh Mahoney with the Water Board, just sent you an email with a new conference line number and a participant code. Please log off of this and call in the other conference line. We'll wait for you there. We're going to sign in right now and get that set up. So just give us a minute, please.
just for the people in the room, just so we have to change conference lines because there was a maximum number of callers that could be on the other line, so we're switching lines to accommodate somebody else that wanted to call in, but we had reached the limit, so give us a moment.
Welcome to AT&T's teleconference service. There are 3 participants on the call, including you. You are joining your conference as the host. For a menu of available commands, press *#.
Hello, this is Ken Clark from OEHA.
Hi, yeah, I think we're back online and in business, so hopefully everybody got back online. The one thing I want to note, and Rebecca can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe anybody that's on the webcast but not on the phone, if you want to ask questions, you can send us an email and we will ask those questions on your behalf. And Rebecca, if you would please, can you make sure everybody, the people on the webcast know what that email is?
Yeah. Yeah, it's waterboard food safety at waterboards.ca.gov. Again, that's waterboard food safety at waterboards.ca.gov.
All right. Good morning, panel members. My name is Josh Mahoney, and today I will be discussing new and expanding projects related to the reuse of produced wastewater for irrigation. Currently, there are 5 active projects that reuse produced wastewater for irrigation and are regulated under waste discharge requirements. The discharges and orders are listed on the screen in no particular order. As seen on the screen, item 4, the Hathaway LLC Kern Tulare Water District and Jasmin Ranchos Mutual Water Company project is expanding, and item 5, the EMB Natural Resources Management Corporation and Sherwood Hills LLC project is new. These 2 items will be discussed in more detail in the upcoming slides. The Jasmin Treatment Facility project is operated by Hathaway LLC, Kern Tulare Water District, and the Jasmin Ranchos Mutual Water Company. The Jasmin Treatment Facility is currently regulated under waste discharge requirements, order number 98-205. This order regulates the discharge of produced wastewater from Hathaway's treatment facility to Kern Tulare and Jasmin Water Company. In 2018, Kern Tulare submitted a report of waste discharge and technical reports, which included a proposal to expand the existing project. After reviewing the report of waste discharge, Central Valley Water Board staff prepared new tentative waste discharge requirements that would regulate the existing facility and the proposed expansion. If adopted, the irrigation or the tentative order would regulate the reuse of produced wastewater for irrigation, the implementation of a new reservoir for additional storage, and would include requirements that need to be completed by the discharger to increase the flow rate of produced wastewater reused for irrigation. The tentative order has been sent out for public comment and is anticipated to be considered for adoption during the June 2019 board meeting. So this one will be coming up in the next board meeting in June. The McVan Area Treatment Facility project is operated by EMB Natural Resources Management Corporation, Sherwood Hills LLC, and 5 other landowners that are identified in the WDRs. The McVan Area Treatment Facility previously disposed of produced wastewater via injection wells operated in the Pozo Creek oil field. Due to the quality of the water, EMB, Sherwood, and other landowners partnered together to reuse this produced wastewater for irrigation. After reviewing the report of waste discharge and technical reports, Water Board staff prepared tentative waste discharge requirements that were released for a 30-day public comment period. Water Board staff responded to the comments and presented the proposed order to the board for consideration of adoption.
This is Carl Longway. I don't know what end the problem is on, but the speaker is fading in and out, and sometimes is inaudible.
Oh, okay. How about, is this better? Oh, yeah, that's probably better.
That's a lot better.
So we had the McVan Area Treatment Facility. Water Board staff reviewed the report of waste discharge and technical reports related to this facility, and we prepared a tentative waste discharge requirements that were released to the public for a 30-day public comment period. Once we got the comments back, we responded to all the comments and then brought this item to the board for consideration of adoption. During the April board meeting, the board listened to presentations and testimony by Water Board staff, members of the public, and the dischargers. At the conclusion of the board meeting, the board members decided to adopt this order as written. And so now the McVan Area Treatment Facility is regulated under waste discharge requirements for the reuse of produced wastewater for irrigation, the discharge and storage of produced wastewater to Sherwood's reservoirs, and the irrigation using produced wastewater for 4,400 acres of cropland that consists of nuts, citrus, oilseed, and grain. This concludes my presentation on new and expanding projects that the board is considering at this time. Are there any questions?
I'm sort of curious, is the board, are you anticipating seeing more applications for this coming up in the future, that this will be expanding? I mean, because of Sigma or other reasons?
Yeah, Bruce. I mean, our general expectation is that, you know, particularly for the water that's very good quality coming from that eastern part of the valley north of the Kern River that doesn't need significant treatment in order to be used for irrigation, we're expecting that there's people out there that would like to use that water, particularly because Kern County is very water deficient. So the area needs any usable water that's of suitable quality. I think also we've seen some pilot tests. I shouldn't say a lot, but we've seen some pilot tests and a fair amount of interest in treating poor quality water that has a lot of salts and doing some kind of treatment, whether it's reverse osmosis or some other treatment to recycle produced water. And you know, I can tell you that I personally anticipate, and Carl may have some thoughts on this also, but I personally anticipate that as water becomes more valuable, there will be even more interest in that, and depending upon what happens as the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is implemented, I've got to believe that demand for water is only going to be increased. And more people will want to use this, assuming that it's of suitable quality, assuming that, you know, we don't have issues associated with the use of this water on crops. And those are big ifs right now, but I think the demand is going to be there, and I expect it only to increase in the future. Seth.
So I know that the newest discharge permit is for expansion of, well, not expansion, but a new use of 100% produced water for irrigation, which is the first of its kind, to my knowledge, in California.
That is correct.
Do you anticipate the majority or many more of these 100% produced water projects without blending being proposed?
You know, that's a great question, Seth, and to be honest with you, I don't know. In this case, it's for an area where there isn't a lot of groundwater and they didn't have district water. So there isn't much other sources of groundwater. I don't know over most of the valley where we see intense agricultural activity, if that's the case. But, I mean, our requirements upon us is that when we have a project proposed to us, is to take a look at it and review it and see whether or not, you know, the use, the recycling of the water is appropriate. So I don't really know the answer. That's kind of a long answer, but the truth is I wouldn't be surprised, but it may not be. It kind of depends upon what other water resources I think are available to the people accepting the water. I don't know, maybe there's somebody from part of the industry or Will wants to make a comment also that maybe has more insight into, you know, what people are proposing in the future. And Carl, I don't know if you've been hearing things either, but Will has a comment to make, so I'll go to Will.
Well, my understanding right now is a lot of it has also to do with what's in there besides the salinity. So it's the boron concentrations, and I think the Pozo folks are lucky that they have the other constituents as well as the salinity is low. And some of the, you know, projects are going to be limited by those kind of constituents.
Yeah, I will say is that what I hear, and maybe Carl wants to confirm that too, is that boron is the big driver because it's very difficult to remove from the wastewater and expensive. So if you're dealing with high boron waters that we see on the west side of the valley, that water is going to be difficult to treat and it's going to be expensive, which may certainly restrict the amount of that water that people want to recycle, at least in the near future.
Clay, this is Carl. You're getting away from the microphone too. My comments are basically along the line of Will. The boron is, and as you stated, the boron is the big culprit. Right now, I expect to see quite a bit of work going on, coming out of some of the Department of Energy desal efforts on boron, but that's to be seen yet.
Does the panel have any other questions or comments about actions that the board is considering taking or the action that we took in the April board meeting? Seeing none, I'll ask the same if any members of the public present here today would like to ask some questions or have any comments about the waste discharge requirements. Seeing none, I'll ask the question of anybody else on the phone. Oh, just a second. We have a person.
Hi, good afternoon, or good morning. So just as more of these projects are approved, I'm curious to know if, are chemicals in use in that field as well, like oil field chemicals for?
You mean in the fields where the water is being reused?
Right, in the specific project.
There are, and we have orders and the waste discharge requirements that have been adopted, and the ones that are being considered require the reporting of all chemicals that are being used. Mm-hmm. And that includes even trade secreted information that has to be reported to the board even if we can't report it publicly, if in fact it's found to be a true trade secret. But we do know what is being used, although we don't always have this specific recipe in the masses.
Mm-hmm. Are the quantities of those chemicals being disclosed that are being used?
I think we have most of the quantities that are being used, but we don't have the specific quantities in the different products. So, You know, they tell us the products that are being used and how much, and that we know all the constituents in, but the trade secret issue is not so much, at least in talking to the big chemical manufacturers, because we spent a fair amount of time with this. The big trade secret issue isn't so much what is in it, it's really the recipe of how much of this and how much of that. So what we require in the water sampling is we require analyses of all the chemicals that can be tested. There are a few that can't, but they have to sample and analyze all of the water for all of the chemicals that are being used and could possibly end up in the water. So we have very good accounting for what's in the water. We have a very extensive list of chemicals that have been analyzed for in the fruit samples. So, you know, the first question is if it's not in the water, it's a little difficult to understand how it gets to the cropland to be a major problem. So far, we've taken a very conservative approach of saying, let's just analyze for it all. Part of that white paper will be to lay out, you know, perhaps a better plan moving forward of, are there certain things that aren't a specific threat that don't need to be analyzed for? And I should clarify, there are some things that are added to the wells, like walnut shells, you know, and we can't analyze for walnut shells. So there are some things like that we don't analyze for because they're clearly not a specific issue. But all of the chemical compounds we are looking at.
And so I had a hard time understanding your reply. So do we know the exact quantities of these chemicals that are going in the ground? So I have a question for this general group. So the city or the Air Resources Board of Los Angeles requires the disclosure of the quantities of chemicals that are going into the ground. And these are chemicals, of course, I think for various concerns, but because it is the Air Resources Board, one would imagine it's because these are air toxins that are being utilized perhaps next to where people live or population centers, sensitive populations. Now that's in the air. This is water, right? And so we're utilizing these chemicals in water that is then being applied to food that, you know, presumably everyone's eating, our children are eating. And so I'm having a hard time understanding that if we're taking water, which will carry these chemicals, and my understanding is that you mentioned reverse osmosis. Now, is this water going through reverse osmosis before it gets on the crops?
No, it's not.
Okay, so there's no reverse osmosis, and there's not really a whole lot of filtration. I mean, I think you mentioned walnut husks as being a method to maybe separate the oil from the water, but if it's not going through reverse osmosis and we don't know the quantities of chemicals going into the water, when we do know quantities of chemicals, because this is good governance to know how much is being used near sensitive receptors, how on earth can we say or even evaluate whether something is safe if we don't know the amounts of chemicals that are going in this water? I mean, presumably, if you're testing this, I would say every minute of every day, then you might be able to say that this is safe. But let's say if you're only testing it one time a day or something like that, perhaps there could be some contaminants getting through. And I honestly mean this in all sense. You're looking at me with kind of a smug look on your face, and I hope that I mean, this is in the interest of public health that we're having this whole conversation. I think that you know, we just want to be genuine to this process.
Oh, I absolutely agree to that. With that, I think you know, Will Stringfellow. That's the reason why we engaged the panel. We've engaged a scientific advisor to help us understand what are the best ways to move through, because certainly what we want to make absolutely certain is that the food that is grown is safe and consumers can comfortably consume that without being concerned that there's any increased risk from the use of this water versus any other produced water. So
Wouldn't a way to do that then to be identify the quantities of chemicals that are being used in these oil fields? Yeah, thank you.
Well, absolutely.
I can't answer your question full, but part of the process is that we are getting the complete list of chemicals that are being used. And in the absence of specific information on how much is being used, we're making the assumption a lot is being used and working backwards from that and saying, what are these chemicals? What are the potential, what are toxic chemicals? What are, common, well-known chemicals that are things like grass, which are generally recognized safe. They're like food additives. We're going through all those lists, and that's part of the process of what we've been doing here for 2 years now. And so our assumption, we would like, as a scientist, I want the mass information sometimes, but if we don't have it, we're assuming the worst and working backwards from there.
Okay, so you feel strongly that your systems of testing or what it is you're doing, not knowing the quantities that this is safe, you'd let little children drink this, or because if we're putting it on food, you'd let people drink it.
I would not drink irrigation water, untreated irrigation water. It's not drinking water. So it's used for irrigation as a different standard than drinking water.
But what do they water? Like, for instance, let's say I buy a piece of this fruit. Has it been washed thoroughly? Could I be actually getting some of what might be in that water on my food or my kids?
I'm going to defer to the food safety panel to answer that one, but my understanding is that food is washed and processed before it's delivered to the consumer. So direct contact with the water is not something we're thinking is a major pathway at this point. So I'll be glad to meet with you afterwards and talk about some of the details of some things, if you'd like.
So you feel that it's not necessary for us to have the quantities of these chemicals, even though we have them at the Air Resources Board?
I would prefer that.
You would prefer that?
But in the absence of that information, it's actually to the disadvantage of the oil industry and the users because we're assuming worst case scenarios. So if we knew, that in this whole oil field with thousands of gallons of water, it was using, just a sprinkle of this material, it would probably come off the list quicker than it will with us not knowing exactly how much is being used.
But in the end, wouldn't it be best for the end user if we are putting water on crops that we're eating to know exactly what is going in that water?
That's a little bit beyond my pay grade to answer that question, but I would like to point out.
You're the one analyzing whether this is safe or not.
What
right?
I'm saying is that if you think about what people use for irrigation, we're using things like the San Joaquin River irrigates a lot of cropland. Nobody's suggesting anybody drink the San Joaquin River. We would want to treat that. People do drink water out of the San Joaquin River.
My understanding is that there isn't any reverse osmosis or there isn't any treatment, right?
No, not significant treatment to remove salts or anything like that, no.
So you're saying that basically like some sample testing that's going on with these foods is going to determine whether this product is safe for young children to be eating?
Well, I think I'm getting out of my realm of expertise, which is water quality and the relationship between that water and applications into irrigation. The food safety of food in this country is a complex subject that they have a large system that is dealing with food safety issues. If somebody can help me out here.
I'm not sure if this is going to help, but I will say that the amendments to the discharge permits that require testing for individual chemical constituents is positive. It wasn't there before, and it is positive. The big gap that I remain seeing here is that there's an assumption that we should be monitoring for individual constituents that were put down oil and gas wells. And the assumption is that those constituents are stable and that they remain those constituents after they're injected, after they're mixed in an oil field reservoir, and after they come up and are exposed to air and change temperatures. Setting up a whole monitoring program based on constituents that we know most of which are probably not that stable, leaves some analytical gaps that I think should be filled. But that's what I can say about that.
So let me see if I just understand this properly, because I'm a layperson. But so what I'm hearing is that you're saying is that we can kind of identify some of these constituents and test for them, but we don't always know what happens when these chemicals mix together or at different temperatures, or is that, am I hearing you right? That there might be some sort of other chemical compound that is created? Is that right?
I think it's entirely possible. The toxicity of that and the potential hazard and risk of that, I know remains understudied and relatively unknown. But yeah.
So we're not looking at a list of these chemicals saying, oh, we know that when these three constituents are mixed together, it can be toxic or whatever, and boy, we should be checking that out. There's not any analysis of that.
Well, I think there is some analysis of that.
Some.
That's
How thorough would you say in
as
percentages?
thorough as you can be with the current level of scientific knowledge.
It's,
I mean, I'm not sure exactly what your question ultimately is, but we have a list of chemicals.
my question is if this is safe for human consumption.
Yeah.
I have big concerns about that.
And I understand that, and I think that's why this panel exists.
I get that, and that's why I'm here trying to ask the right questions, because I don't think, there's not a whole lot of the general public here today, but I'm sure that the general public would want to know these sorts of things, and I feel like I'm asking questions that any person
Well, I think
would
they're
want.
good questions, and I think the problem is getting into the details of it is a little complicated
Uh-huh.
in a public forum here. We've done a couple of things. I would be glad to sit down and meet with you and
Great.
go use some of the stuff that's already been done by the panel.
Okay.
And then, just going back to the chemical list, though, is we know the chemicals that are on there. We, in a lot of ways, would prefer to know exactly how much is used every day, but because of, rules about intellectual property, we don't necessarily have access to that information all the time. In that case, we assume the worst case we can think of. Okay? That's all I can assure the public. That's the approach we're taking.
Well, I would say this, to me, this is, again, if we can have this sort of disclosures in Los Angeles for the Air Resources Board, I don't see why we can't have these sorts of disclosures for water that is going on crops that are children or that we're eating. And I would strongly suggest that if this is a panel wishes to actually come out with a very truthful, transparent outcome for whether this practice is safe, we're actually going to need to know absolutely what those quantities are. Again, if the Air Resources Board can do it for the Los Angeles area, I don't see why we can't do it for our food.
My first comment to that would be is that if I had the absolute quantities, I would not be able to disclose it to the public. The members of the panel would not be able to see that, and even Dr. Stringfellow would not be able to see that, because that would have to be held as a confidential business secret under California law, under a trade secreted formulation. I worked diligently with the chemical manufacturing companies, including their attorneys, to work out a form that we could get all of the chemicals that are being used so that we could publicly report that and be transparent. Because I didn't personally want to be in a situation where I sat up here and you asked me what's in the products, and I said, I know everything that's in the products, but I can't share it with you. If I had the masses, trade secret claims would be made, and I would not be able to share that with our experts that were not employed by the state of California. I could not legally do that, and I would be subject to severe penalties if we release that to the public.
Do you know how the Air Resources Board in Los Angeles gets
I
around
do
that?
not know how the Air Resources Board got that, but our approach is
Maybe that could be something that this panel could look into. I mean, it seems like if they're able to get this information and we're able to say, for instance, 7 million pounds of hydrochloric acid is being used on average on a yearly basis in Los Angeles in operations, on average 3 million pounds of hydrochloric or hydrofluoric acid is being used. Now, we have those sorts of specific numbers. I don't understand why we can't get those for something again.
Well, I
That's-
get masses of products, and we could probably make rough estimates, but for the chemicals that are really concerned, and at least from a water quality standpoint, some of the acids probably are not going to be our primary concern.
Well, ethyl benzene, 40,000 pounds on average is being used in LA. We do know that.
Well,
And that's something that we would surely want to know how much of that is being used in any particular field,
But-
if it's going to be going on to our food, right?
Yeah,
And especially if there's not any filtration or right, reverse osmosis.
well, understand reverse osmosis is to remove certain types of constituents. It does not remove all constituents, and Will and Carl can correct me. The organic compounds probably would not be significantly affected by reverse osmosis. It's for the inorganics, the saline issues of it is what it removes.
Right. So there's going to be some things
Metals
that
and
it
salinity.
won't take out.
Yeah, it
all of
would
it.
need other treatments probably if you were truly going to treat it
But-
for organic compounds. So I just want to make that clear. Basically, based upon the water quality, is that this water doesn't need reverse osmosis because the salinity is very good. I mean, it's low already, better than a lot of irrigation water supplies that are currently being used from other sources. We have the water tested. It's true that we do not do continuous sampling, but we have periodic sampling that's done over and over. And the way that the system is used, where a lot of these chemicals being used are actually put either into a well that comes out slowly, gets mixed with a lot of other wells. We think the frequency of the sampling with the overall scope of the analyses is providing a good picture of what's in the water. So we think the water is a good guide. Like I say, we've tested the fruit also for all of these constituents to see if anything's showing up in the fruit.
And the combinations that we were just like the
Well,
chemical
that's
things that.
part of the work that Bernie is going to talk about here in a little while, because that's the toxicological issues that the water boards don't have the expertise in. Well, also one of the things we've asked them to look at is to look at those degradation products to say, if something were to happen to this one compound, in this form it may not be very toxic, but could it be toxic if something were to happen to it? We're asking those questions also. So that's the work of the panel that the experts are doing, being paid for by industry, overseen by me with input from Dr. Stringfellow and the panel, and Dr. Longley, our board chairman. And then we look to the panel. So we have a draft report out on the toxicological issues that is up on the webpage. That it's a little bit technical, but certainly staff would be happy to answer any questions if you have about
And I
that.
look forward to that, but I think just as like the public trust, right, generally is going to have a hard time accepting that this is safe without us actually knowing the exact chemical constituents that are going into this and the quantities.
Well-
I think that this is a disclosure issue, and that if this is something that we're putting into our bodies, this, to me, is we really need to know these things.
Clay, what I'd like to add is, of course, I think you really need to be referring back to the testimony provided by Dr. Gary Banuelos, probably one of the top plant physiologists in the country. And Dr. Banuelos pointed out that really our concern should not be organics, but really the inorganics, because the plants typically will not take up the organics. In fact, they are very rigorously consumed by and changed by the microorganisms you find in the soil. And we have seen the fact that in fact in one of our controls that we will have inorganic uptake when it's there. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be, as we are, looking for all of these organics and their prevalence in the fruit. But, I think that we have other issues too. And those other issues, if a grove happens to be near a highway, you're going to get exhaust fumes off of that highway onto the fruit too. And that's one of the contaminants we have to be careful about. This is a very complex issue. And I'm confident that using people like Dr. Banuelos as outside consultant, if you will, with a panel that's highly qualified, that we're looking at everything that we can look at with the available science. Thank you.
Right. Well, I think that part of that available science will be informed by the exact chemical disclosures, and I would be very interested in making sure that we can do that. I think if that actually can be done by the Air Resources Board in Los Angeles and ask for those sorts of disclosures, I don't see why we can't have that on something that's going on our food.
Well, sir, we've been informed by our attorneys we can't, and we'll check that.
Okay, great. I hope, I'm sure we'll continue this discussion, but I am looking forward to finding out more.
No. I have one last favor to ask, if you wouldn't mind, sir. Can you please let us know who you are?
Oh, sure. My name's David Braun. Hi, how are you? I'm
good.
on your listserv and have been tracking this a little
okay.
bit as I can, but just a concerned citizen and want to make sure that we're not getting cancer in our mandarins, cuties, and things like that.
Trust me, I have the same concern. That's the reason we put the panel together with a group of experts. But thank you for
I
your
appreciate
comments.
it. Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Clay.
Do we have any other comments or questions that anybody would like to make?
Yeah, I do. I got a little lost in this conversation. Chevron has an extensive water treatment facility before it goes out to the irrigation districts. Now, do these smaller operators also have something similar to treat the water before it's released for irrigation water?
It's not all as rigorous as what Chevron goes through. But again, most of the treatment is primarily to separate the oil from the water. It's not necessarily to treat so it's an organic compound removal more than it is the inorganics. Again, the treatment for the inorganics hasn't been needed based upon the quality of the water, that the borons does not exceed water quality objectives, and the salinity in many instances is actually pretty good.
So there is some treatment.
There is some treatment. There is a Chevron representative in the.
Yeah, I'm talking about the smaller operators.
Yeah, they all go through oil-water separation processes because, again, that's their product. They want to collect the oil so that they can sell it. Some are just a little more sophisticated than others.
And then before it reaches the irrigation district, the water is analyzed for all these different constituents.
Yes, it is. And there are limits on the amount of oil and grease, which are basically the petroleum hydrocarbons. And then we have the testing for the other compounds. And part of the work and part of the white paper will be, are there other compounds that we need to be testing for? And what's the recommendation of the panel as we move forward and continue to look at this? Yes, Bill.
Is it on? Yeah. I'm Bill Alio with the Environmental Working Group, and since we're on a general discussion of the topic, I thought I'd weigh in and can answer some of Mr. Braun's questions too and raise others. I believe it was the presence of Environmental Working Group and Clean Water Action that was the catalyst for the food safety panel. And I think of everything that's happened now in almost 3 years. A lot of money is being spent on water quality monitoring and food testing. And we think that's a good thing overall. And we appreciate the dollars spent by the public and the private sectors to do this, but it was a question that needed to be answered, and hopefully we'll get to the end and say it's been safe all along. But a couple things on the water filtering or treatment. It's not comprehensive or extensive. It's basically running it through a walnut shell filter. I mean, they do the oil separation beginning to get their, as you say, to get their product. That's what's valuable. And then it goes through the walnut shell filter, and I would call that a crude method of water filtering. Then it goes downstream, and it's in a polishing pond, which I found out is basically skimming off excess oil. So clearly the treatment going on upstream at Chevron or the other companies is not comprehensive. It ends up on the valley floor, and I have not been there, but I've seen videos and read, still smelling a bit like oil, and you can see an oil sheen, hence the polishing pond. So say you get even 90% more or more, 95% of the hydrocarbon out of that before it goes into the canal for irrigation. What you can't see or smell are the chemicals used on the site, either brought up naturally like boron elements or added in the drilling process, the manufacturing separation process, the clean outs that are done at wells periodically. And so it's the unseen stuff that we thought, could this be getting in food as well as possibly hydrocarbons? And that, I think, is what the food safety panel was engaged to find out. And the early answers on that, where we've tested some citrus, came out about the first year. It looks good, and some random garlic, potatoes, I think. Things were taken. And the early look looks pretty good. But there are very few MCL or maximum contaminant levels for most of the stuff coming downstream. So you could say, and it's true, the answer was, is that water tested before it goes down? And it is, but the suite of things you're looking at is very narrow. And you could say we're meeting the state MCLs on X, Y, and Z, but you aren't even testing for 50 things that are in the waste stream coming from Chevron or other oil companies. So that's why we're concerned. Lastly, on the testimony of Dr. Banuelos, last October, I believe it was. It might have been summer, I can't remember now. That was great to see him here because I respect the time all the food safety panel is spending, has been spending the last 3 years, and everyone's present to come. He was the first person that actually appeared before the food safety panel and the regional board staff who knew what he was talking about in terms of uptake by plants of these constituents. And he's an expert, and I guess he could have been on the food safety panel. He didn't end up being on it, but it was great to have him here for an hour plus. And one thing I remember he said is, I would not grow root crops or tuber crops in that soil. That's what he said, point blank. He thought woody plants like a almond tree probably pretty safe, but he doesn't know for sure. But in his research, he's looking at the uptake of various elements by woody plants, and he thinks that's a low risk. And some actually take certain constituents up better, and that's what his work is about. Can we use plants to remove certain elements from soil to make it more farmable, arable? But when he said that, I go, that's why we're here. That maybe carrots, maybe potatoes, maybe onions do take this up because they're grown in the very soil. And that's why we've been frustrated that the first thing that should have been tested is the soil. Is there buildup in the soil? And then you might go, wait a minute, there's a lot of buildup of whether it's boron, but we assume not because we know boron can kill an almond tree, as demonstrated in the Star Farms thing on the west side, southwest side of the valley. But could it get into a carrot? And that's the very essence here, and we're slowly getting at that. I still am mystified by why we didn't go after soil testing first and root crops first, and then later get to almonds and oranges. That's the last thing I would worry about. But again, I'm no expert. It's just sort of the logical flow of things from the east side down into the valley. So that, I think, answers some of David's questions. And we're getting to those answers. It's been frustratingly slow because other projects keep getting approved. And they're using crude treatment to use this water. And the latest stuff of non-blended water is of more concern, but We don't know because of all the invisible things in that water. And hopefully get to the answers sooner than later about especially root crops, tuber crops, as Dr. Banuelos warned against doing, and yet more projects have been approved since he spoke, and another one's on the table. And I think Mr. Rogers is absolutely right. There will be more droughts. It's a critical water situation in the San Joaquin Valley, and people will have demand for this water from the east side, which is a much higher quality than the west side. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. And I just want to add that, I lost my train of thought, but I was just going to add that, you know, we are looking to the panel and the white paper to, you know, make recommendations about future work that needs to be done. And also, that's also the reason that we have decided that all of the root crops that come out are going to be sampled. You know, so if they grow garlic, we're going to sample garlic at least until the white paper is done and we get the recommendations of the panel. Carrots will be sampled, any of the root crops are like that. I will also add that Dr. Longley and I first met with Dr. Banuelos quite a while ago when the panel was actually being put together, and I personally asked Dr. Banuelos to be on the panel. Unfortunately, his schedule, because he is so busy and in such demand, he could not agree to be on the panel. And but we were fortunate that he was able to come and make a presentation and share his expertise. Unfortunately, and Dr. Longley can back me up on this, I believe there are very few people with the expertise that Dr. Banuelos has. So we were very appreciative, and I think he did a great job of helping to inform the issues that are before us.
Hi, Mike Garabedian, Friends of the North Fork American River. I have a question. The question is, what is the continuing involvement of plant physiology in the work of the group?
Well, I can answer that it's partially included in the task 2 literature reviews to start looking at those subjects, you know, systematically. It's been part of the conversation, part of the investigation from day one. But I think to get it put in a formal, you know, a formal, structured, conclusive form is part of what is involved with the task 2 literature review. Is that, I'm not sure I answered your question, but
I guess the question is there continuing involvement day to day in the work here, and an example would be the question of bioaccumulation and how your sampling is dealing with that. Some crops, some plants are very heavy accumulators, others aren't, but more than there certainly is literature review, I assume, but I'm just curious about what the input. I would think the panel, I would guess that you would need ongoing involvement.
Well, I would say that that's part of the
stage.
continuing evaluation. That we're including that as part of a continuing evaluation.
And who does that? Is it?
Well, I think we do it as a panel, and we're doing as part of the sampling program is related to that.
So there is plant physiology on the panel.
I'd like to add to that. Actually, a couple of us on the panel have backgrounds in plant physiology, and it was from the very beginning. For some of you that maybe have been here for a while, but maybe haven't been and aren't familiar with where we started from and such, that was always a consideration in it and will remain so. But you have to start at the point of finding out what's in the water and whether the amounts are going to be significant. The presentation that we had a couple of meetings ago was really good in terms of laying out where some of the concerns were quantitatively for movement through the plant into what we eat, and we're well aware the roots accumulate differently than fruits, and leaves accumulate differently from fruits and roots. So that'll all be considered farther down the line as we have more information on that.
Well, and I was just responding to what I heard. Thank you.
We have any other comments? Rebecca?
We have a question on the email list. This question comes from Justin Bass. He asks, is good, clean drinking water, aka fresh water, used for well stimulation or oil drilling in the Central Valley? If so, how much fresh water is used for well stimulation or oil drilling annually? Do you have numbers for 2017 and 2018? I've asked the Water Board, Dogger, the oil companies, and oil company affiliates. Nobody seems to know the amount of fresh water used for well stimulation or oil drilling in the Central Valley. Is anybody accounting for the good, clean drinking water used for going down the oil drilling hole? Thank you.
You know, that's outside the purview of the water boards. So I can't personally answer that question. I'll ask the panel in a minute. You know, that information may be available from the Dogger. I do not know. And that question, I mean, you know, Mr. Bass, I'd be willing to talk to you if you want to give me a call next week when I'm back in the office, but, you know, really is kind of outside the purview of the food safety issues. That's more of a water supply, water use issue in general. And I think Dr. Shonkoff wanted to make a comment.
I was just going to say that certainly is beyond the purview of this panel to a certain degree, but the best place I could recommend to go look is in the Senate Bill 4 independent scientific study conducted by CCST in the water section.
Bill Allio, Environmental Working Group. To the caller or emailer, yes, Senate Bill 4 mandated that all wells fracked be logged on a website, on Dogger's website, and list the chemicals used and the amount of water used. So that's the first time California's been tracking that. The bill passed in 2013, so they should have about 2-3 years of data now. I haven't looked at it recently myself. I've been moving on to other things, but other aspects at Dogger, like the underground injection control program and linking that with the water board, and so much progress has been made there. But I think you can find it on the Dogger website, amount of water used per well. I'm not sure if they're doing cumulative totals though. But in general, fracking in other parts of the country uses much greater volumes of fresh water to get the job done than California does due to geology.
Hi, Brian Pellins with CRC. I would just add that SB 1281 required extensive accounting for water, field uses, both fresh and non-fresh. That's all reported to Dogger on a quarterly basis. They have the data.
Do you know if that information is available on the web page? And the response is they believe it's available in Dogger's databases that you can access through their web page. All right. Now I think we're finally ready to move on to Bernie, but I evidently lost him.
We have one more question on the email.
Oh, okay. We have another question.
This question comes from Laura Hayter. She says, please prohibit the use of endocrine disrupting and carcinogenic chemicals like methylene chloride in oil drilling in Kern County.
Comment noted. Bernie, I think you're back just in time. I don't know. We're getting a little noise in the room. Maybe somebody on the phone, if you could go on mute, please.
All right. Okay, great. So we just wanted to take a few minutes to update you on the progress of the 3 tasks. So Rebecca was kind enough to actually give us a brief overview of the 3 tasks, which was a selection of the chemicals of interest known to either be used in oil and gas production or be naturally occurring. We're concerned about their potential presence in irrigation waters. A literature review which focuses on those chemicals of interest in the context of the use of produced water for agricultural irrigation. And then sampling and chemical analysis of crops that have been watered with produced water. So I'm not going to go through the excruciating detail of what's already presented in the report and what I presented last meeting, but I'm going to give a very brief, quick overview. We started out with 385 chemicals which we evaluated, 90 of which of those were naturally occurring. 312 of them were unique chemical additives. If you add those up, a little more than 385, there's a little bit of overlap between the two. And so going through the process of evaluation, starting with the 385 chemicals, first screening was to identify those chemicals that were either generally regarded as safe by the FDA, so these are the grass chemicals that were mentioned earlier today, or those that are virtually non-toxic. So these are known food additives, chemicals that are inert or break down into inert chemicals when combined with water. Of the remaining 315, we did a screening of the toxicologic literature, and from that, we identified 62 chemicals where there wasn't sufficient information to make any determination, so they require some further research. There was 253 chemicals remaining, and from these, we developed these 4 databases. 64 of them identified chemicals where there was no chronic toxicity. 11 of them had incomplete information to assess their toxicity. 173, we developed toxicity values in which we used to rank, identify chemicals potentially of interest. 122 of those were based off published toxicity values, and 51 of them GSI-derived toxicity values. And then there were 5 radionuclides. So to summarize where we are currently, we've submitted a draft report to the Water Board and Food Safety Panel. It's currently posted online. We've received comments back from the Food Safety Panel and are currently working on incorporating and addressing any of their concerns. Should be noted that the report doesn't necessarily reflect the full work that was proposed in the scope of work. This was about incorporating fate and transport and plant uptake into the selection of chemicals. This was through discussion with the Water Board and their scientific advisor, Will Stringfellow. GSI had some misgivings about setting specific criteria values for these fate and transport parameters because there was some concern about uncertainty of how these would translate out into sort of these real-world processes of produced water being produced, delivered, and then ultimately used for irrigation water. And so we're looking for some advice from the Food Safety Panel on how to proceed here, what they feel would be most helpful for them to help make recommendations once they receive the white paper. And so these are issues of fate and transport, I think especially for some of the more toxic chemicals. Again, addressing issues of breakdown products and maybe talking about those in the literature review, and then addressing those chemicals without toxicity data. And our initial, what we initially want to do is maybe address those as like large groups of chemicals in the literature review, things like surfactants and sorbent polymers. But if the Food Safety Panel has some specific ideas about what would be most helpful for them, would be willing and would really appreciate any input. And so I don't know if you want to discuss these now or at the very end, but this would be a good place to either stop or move on to task 2. I guess
I'll say something.
Yeah, sure, great.
When I read the scope of work, The task one, the idea was to come up with that list of chemicals of interest, which would then feed into the literature review. It seems
Yes.
like that's not happening.
Well,
And besides, beyond just the plant uptake, and this gets back to this long discussion we had this morning, beyond just the plant uptake issues, or fate and transport in general, was factoring in concentrations into that, coming up with that list of chemicals of interest. I know we can't get that exactly, but we should have a pretty good, a sense on some of them. For example, we have quite a bit of water quality data already. When I look at your table 7, which is, your list of toxicity criteria, which by itself is very misleading, and then, people could read into that the wrong thing.
How so?
Well,
Just like
that is simply a list of toxicity, but that doesn't get anything as far as what might actually be in the crops, which is what we're ultimately looking at. So that's only part of the picture.
Yeah,
and,
I mean,
and I think that needs to be made clear that that's only part of the picture.
Yeah, I mean, we tried to talk about that at the very beginning, where this is about a hazard identification, which is different than a risk assessment. That these are chemicals which have the potential to create hazard or create a risk, but we don't know enough about them at this stage here to make that assessment. We have task 2, which is going to review this in more detail, and we have also in the context of the water data that we have, and then we have task 3, where we're sampling crops for what we do know, and we're going to be able to identify sort of what we can measure, what we can't measure, and what we do know about and don't know about.
So I guess one question would be, are you intending to come up with this list of chemicals of interest?
Well, I think that is going to be a little bit, we're going to defer a little bit to the food safety panel with that. If you would like us to try and attempt to incorporate things like fate and transport into this and winnow this list down, with the caveat that there's the potential that fate and transport may remove chemicals that some may see as a concern, then we're happy to do that. But
So-
I mean, we see that as one of these, like, one of the hurdles that need to be addressed before we can move forward in creating this like well-defined list of chemicals of interest.
Then what do you intend to do basically with what you have here as table 7? What's the intent of that?
Well, I think that's part of what this meeting is, to help address that issue. Like, right now, we're in the position where we're starting up at the top of the list and moving down.
So you're...
And this is part of the discussion that we talked about last meeting too, that we will be looking at sort of like some top number of these chemicals, unless we make some decision otherwise about how to screen them out.
Will you be looking at water quality data that's existing now?
Yes.
Because when I look at table 7, most of these to me look like they're naturally occurring.
Yes.
And most of them we have water quality data for.
Yes.
So right off the bat, that's information that could be incorporated.
Sure.
Okay.
Can I interject for a second? That's exactly the kind of feedback we need and what Bernie needs, because part of where, we didn't keep diving into the fate, using fate criteria to eliminate compounds is taking a conservative approach. There are criteria that I think can be used, such as biodegradation testing, that would eliminate a lot of the compounds off the list, but I think there needs to be agreement among the panel that those are appropriate criteria. Rather than from the bottom up, we need to go back and forth to make sure everybody's on the same page.
Yeah, and I think as much as possible, that information definitely should be incorporated.
But
Yeah,
but if I can interject again, is what I'm hearing from you, which I think is brilliant, is if we can agree that there's a criteria that if it's the compounds on the list, we have good quality measurements for that compound, and it hasn't been found after all this monitoring, then it's okay to put that on the resolved list. That we don't need to write a extensive fate and effects report on that particular compound, because part of the big process here is we have a lot of different compounds. We can't write a 4 or 20 volume thesis on each of these compounds.
Which is why we were trying to get it narrowed down with this list of chemicals of interest.
I think
That's exactly what the point was.
And I think they've done that to a certain point. Now we just need to take the next step.
Well, I don't see that, though. I see a list of toxicity hierarchy here, and that's it. I don't see anything that narrows things down.
Can I add into this? So in the report, we say as we went through the initial task, we realized, and I think we talked about this last time, that the knowledge, the state of the science on, say, plant uptake, soil absorption, et cetera, was not something that we could come up with an algorithm and say, okay, we really only need to worry about these 15 chemicals. These are the only ones that have opportunity to get into the plants. We know there just isn't enough information about the fate and transport. So what we've done is said, okay, let's look at the most toxic. And because, for reasons we said earlier, we really don't know which of those are really used in trivial amounts and which are used in big amounts. The reason for the priority was to say, let's make sure we don't miss anything that we know has high toxicity. Now we're going to go through and look at things like biodegradation, absorption to soil, and put them into categories to say, okay, which of these look like they're the most important. In addition to the fact that we've talked about the fact that we've got some plant data already. We've got some crop data that so we get to kind of go back and forth a little bit.
And water quality data.
And our plan is to say, even though we didn't have that highlighted in the original 3 tasks, the water quality data is going to be very important. We realize we need to go back and
you
look.
actually do, though. I mean, when I read the scope of work, it's one of the factors that says maybe at high or detectable levels in irrigation water.
Yeah. So we're going to go back and look at that as that will be. I think that will. My sense right now is that will probably be the most important determiner now as we take this list of the 385 and narrow it down into the higher priority chemicals to look at.
Yeah, and I would suggest, incorporating the water quality data, but what it might also do is help you focus on perhaps chemicals that you might want to get concentration data for, in some sense. I mean, maybe you can't get exact numbers, but get some sense of what the concentrations may be for some of these unknown chemicals.
Concentrations in
what?
Well,
production chemicals. You're talking in the oil production chemicals or in the crops?
I mean,
yeah.
so for some of the, not so much the naturally occurring, but some of the additives, maybe you can get some, focus what you might want to get that for, as opposed to just, the whole world of them.
Yeah, I mean, it would be value if we could go back and say, this is a chemical that's very high on the toxicity list. Do you use 4 ounces of it a year, or do you use 4 tons of it a year?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we may be able to get that out, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But the plan is, I mean, there was a little bit of shift in that we are planning now to take this list of toxicity, the ranked toxicity chemicals, and focus on those that are the highest toxicity. We realize that all these other factors need to be considered, and we're doing
that really
those more
wasn't
as a task
clear
two.
in the draft that we got.
Yeah, we can
revise that.
And that's one of the things I asked for was, what's next steps? I mean, this report just basically ends at table 7.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, there is some discussion of it in there, but I agree. We will clarify that and make that, put a stronger focus on that in the next draft. Thank you.
So good conversation so far. So in reviewing, I don't remember which table it was, maybe it was table 7, you list how you sort of knock certain chemicals off as probably not concern. And one of them is grass, generally regarded as safe. And in my review of the grass chemicals that were selected, I didn't see anything that jumped out at me as particularly concerning. That said, if what we're doing or what you're doing right now is setting up a structure for how to evaluate chemical constituents on an ongoing basis into the future, I think we should be a little careful about relying too heavily just on grass, considering that those compounds have not, in many cases, gone through a systematic review in terms of their toxicity, and there's no sort of update. I shouldn't say there is no. There are rarely updates.
I understand the concern.
So again, I don't see a problem with what you've assigned as grass and knocked off the list in this report right now. But if we're setting up a systematic and objective process into the future, I think we should think through, the use of grass and under what conditions.
Would just
Yeah.
I mean, this is more of a very specific operational question. So would you be comfortable instead of say using grass, but if these are identified food additives or known food supplements as being reasonable ways to screen out those particular chemicals from sort of what could be a growing list of chemicals?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And it's a little hard for me to answer, in absolute terms, exactly what the process should be on top of grass, which is a fine first cut. But just in general, these are dynamic systems. These 385 compounds are likely not going to be the compounds that we would see in 10 years from now. I'm sure a lot of them would be, but I'm sure there's going to be different ones. And so there's probably going to be, there will be an ongoing assessment of this based on disclosure in the discharge permit requirements.
Yeah.
Right? So there's that issue. And then you asked the panel for some ideas about how to think about the degradation product issue and the potential for transformation. So I'm sure people have a variety of ways of thinking about this. In my opinion, we should take a little bit of a cue from the municipal wastewater reuse world and think about, and I understand that there's been a focus on testing of crops, but I think it would be useful to consider adding in a component to this project to try and figure out what the risk is. I think it would be useful to incorporate some sort of non-targeted testing of produced water, and maybe that comes from split samples taken. And I know this might go beyond the scope that's currently laid out for GSI, but I'm not quite sure how else we would figure this out. So for whatever it's worth, I'm just entering into the record that I think that it would be useful to do some non-targeted testing to sort of see what's in the water. I'm less concerned about doing non-targeted testing in fruit because that seems, if we think the science is complicated at the water level, I don't, it's silly to look at the fruit. And if there's not a problem in the water, then I wouldn't really expect there to be a problem in the fruit. So that's what I think about that.
Seth, if we were to do that, what would be your criteria or criterion for saying there wasn't a problem? Or it was a problem? This has bedeviled folks for decades, if not longer. And the problem, you could pose it as, they could have a mixture, and a mixture can be a problem. Things degrade, and maybe it gets worse or something. We don't see that epidemiologically, but it comes back to, you can put it out there, and then how are you going to make a decision? What would you say it's okay or it's not okay based on?
I would not go so far as to say I'm ready to completely answer that methodological question right now. I think it should be considered. I think it's considered across multiple analogous sectors. And I don't see why it should be off the table with an emerging water source. There was just a large report put out in the municipal wastewater reuse space that recommended this, and not for the scary viral load in that, but for chemicals of emerging concern and things that we can't find going chemical by chemical. And so I don't really see the point of not thinking through how that might look.
Hi, Barney. This is Dave Mazzara, Public Health. Just a couple questions for you on the third item that's addressing those chemicals without toxicity data.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure you've done this before in other projects, so this is not new to you. I think a lot of us have seen this type of thing before. But what is your general process for, as an expert in this area and a consultant, in trying to figure out what to do? How did you identify those chemicals? And then what are some of the things you think about when you group them?
Well, those chemicals were identified after going through and basically doing whatever kind of search we could to basically identify what the chemical was. Was there any literature or knowledge about the toxicity?
Right.
And so those were chemicals where there was no information, basically no information. When we want to group them, we want to group them maybe by what they're used for, which tend to normally be related to their functional sort of properties or chemical functional properties.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, a lot of these chemicals are rather complex polymers. They're not monomer. They're not like monomer-built polymers. These are sort of complex, sort of heterogeneous polymers. And these are normally not chemicals that people address. I mean, most times, and what we've done for for some of the chemicals that we derive sort of toxicity for, is we do read-across studies where we identify similar chemicals that may have similar functional groups that we know interact with the human body in specific ways, and use that as a surrogate to develop sort of some understanding of toxicity. But in this case, a lot of these are very complex molecules. We're not sure how the shape and the available functional groups could potentially interact inside the human body, if they even will interact or be absorbed. In some cases, because the polymers are so large, they're likely just to pass through. But that doesn't mean that they can't interact potentially with tissues during their traverse through the human body. And so this is sort of where we have this problem. Like how would we best serve the food safety panel in making decisions about this? I mean, we can go through the process that we would do, which is basically what I described.
Right.
Maybe look on how some polymer, like the toxicologic properties of sort of polymers in general, and look at that, but that doesn't necessarily allow us to categorize them in a quantitative way. I mean, we could say that this might be toxicologically active at this site given these functional groups, but at the same time, we don't totally understand the structure of the polymer, and so that can ultimately change its toxicologic property.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that, because I just wanted you to kind of walk through what your thinking was behind how you identified those, and then talk about surrogates. You look at surrogates. If there's nothing there, then you still have this group of unknown chemicals that don't have a lot of toxicity data, or known chemicals that don't have a lot of toxicity data. In your experience, when you get to that sorting out of chemicals at the end that don't have a lot of data, what is the general assumption of those? do you default into a very conservative assumption that those are bad things or those are unknown? I mean, do we pull them into a parking lot of wait to see? What has been the experience with that group of chemicals in other projects? I'm not necessarily talking about, we haven't gotten to this project yet, but what would you generally do with those kind of unknown chemicals?
For these kinds of chemicals, that's a little bit outside of where I have any experience that could really inform it. Perhaps Rob has a little bit more.
Yeah. And I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
Yeah,
I'm just
I understand. I mean,
general...
these are really interesting, unique chemicals that are not commonly encountered, and so for that reason, it makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah, I think that question is going to be a key outcome of this study, is because part of what we're commissioned to do is look at what are the data gaps, what do we need to know.
Yes.
And then and some of that might be we just don't know anything about the toxicity of these group of chemicals. There will probably be a big group of chemicals like these polymers that Bernie's referring to that we say we really don't know the toxicity of them. Part of the reason they've not been tested is that category of chemicals is just generally not considered to be very toxic, and so nobody wants to spend the money to go do the expensive tox studies. And so we'll try to parse those out and say, okay, these are probably not toxic, but we don't really have data for them. And others we might say, wow, this one is showing up frequently and we don't know the toxicity of it, and probably something we should look into. So we will identify all of those. That's part of what we're specifically looking for is uncertainties and data gaps, and then we'll try to put some priority on them. But I think, as we get further and further into all this literature, we're finding that there's going to be a lot of questions about this. I mean, I think partly what will help us is we're probably looking at pretty low concentrations, and so there'll be some overall findings, but gaps will be part of that as well.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your patience with my questions, because I really just wanted for us at the panel and for the public to hear a little bit more detail about what I think is, you had touched on this in your draft report, but maybe people haven't seen that yet. So I thought it would be a good way to talk a little bit more in detail about that process and then how we get to that group of chemicals without data.
No, I appreciate that. That's great.
So thank you.
Can I ask a question from the panel? And I don't know if I can get a straight answer from anybody, if they need time to think about it, but what does the panel feel about a blanket, idea that polymers are not a priority problem? And I believe there's guideline from EPA in general about polymers that puts them on a pretty low priority list. Does the panel have a particular opinion of that or want to form one? That would be very useful.
Well, I think as was stated, I mean, that kind of information, they're going to be unknowns. That's just probably what the outcome is going to be. But that kind of information, be able to provide that information might be a little bit better information to have. But also, we said they're probably at low concentrations, but we don't know that. As much as we can get information on that, the better.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what they're being used for. I mean, a lot of them are sorbent polymers, but I don't know where or how in that process they're being used.
I have one thing to add to that. So there's kind of two divergent paths here that I think are important. There's the stuff that's really interesting to know, maybe people are curious about it and they want to know what's going on with these chemicals. But from a regulatory standpoint, as a regulator from the department where I come from, I can't act on things that we don't know anything about. They can be identified as unknowns and things that we can look for in the future or ongoing, but we can't take regulatory action on unknowns. So from my department's perspective, we would not be able to do anything with chemicals that don't have data or some surrogate or something that's tangible that shows that there's a potential risk or public health impact.
Mm-hmm.
So from my perspective, that's where our limitation, that's where we have to kind of draw that line. And that's not to say that we wouldn't look at these in the future or ongoing to some degree. We work with our folks at the Water Board or our partners in other places to kind of monitor these things and test for them. But we can't take regulatory action against things that we don't know much about. I know that may not provide comfort to people who are worried about these things, but that's our limitation. So the question about polymers, if we don't know much about them, or we don't have any definitive information that groups them into some kind of category that has toxicological data or some kind of risk associated with it or something, we would not be able to do anything about that.
You wouldn't be able to do it either way. You wouldn't be able to say these are not a problem or they are a problem without something
It has to
very
be definitive.
specific.
We have to have some type of standard or some type of reference for us to take action on that.
Steve Beam, California Department of Food and Agriculture. I just wanted to echo those remarks from the Department of Public Health, because we would be in the same situation. I mean, we have to identify something that's clearly deleterious or something that could affect public health before we could take any kind of action. And I've said from the very beginning of this process, I think it's important for us to understand that we're going to have things that we will have to put into a parking lot. There's going to have to be things that we say we just don't know, and we're going to have to set it aside as something we don't know. And we're going to have to make decisions and recommendations on what we do know and be honest about the gaps. And part of the project is to identify those gaps. And I don't think we should expect anything else out of this process. With respect to large groups of chemicals where we don't have any toxicity data, again, if we don't have evidence that they are indeed a public health risk, they really shouldn't be called out as being a concern, because we don't know one way or the other. And any kind of statement with respect to polymers generally that could be used to inform the readers, I would be in favor of, because you also don't want to present any kind of unnecessarily alarm about something when the answer is we don't know. But not knowing doesn't mean danger necessarily. It's just we don't know.
Yeah.
That's all.
Any other questions on task one?
I just had one thing. Some of us did provide comments, and
We're
there was-
we're working on those
okay.
right now. Yeah,
Because we did get another version, but that's not like that incorporated some of that, but it was hard to tell what was done.
Anything. I mean, we got some of those comments back, and some of them required a more substantive addressing of those concerns. If there were sort of really easy ways to address sort of wording that may have communicated some of those ideas better, I made some of those changes, but the substantive comments that needed addressing,
You're still working.
They're still working on those. Yeah.
And it'd be nice also to get a response to what the comments were as well, just to see what you did, or how what you thought about it.
Sure.
As well.
Yeah. Okay. Task. So this sort of moves us into looking at task 2, which was the literature review of these chemicals. These were sort of the areas where we were focusing the actual review. So review of produced water used in agriculture, other sources of these chemicals, including agricultural natural sources, ambient levels, known levels in foodstuff, a more detailed description of sort of the chronic oral toxicities. So we'll take some of that data that we've researched in this first step and then be a little bit more explanative about it. Also addressing potentially those chemicals that require further evaluation, and those with sort of some incomplete information, then the fate transport plan uptake, and then the identification of those knowledge gaps. And so we're currently working with the Water Board to finalize the methods for the literature review, including inclusion criteria. We've actually started on some of the literature review where these inclusion criteria sort of don't impact it that much, but we're looking at 5 main factors: date, method of oil and gas extraction, location, language of the publication, and the types of publication. So for literature focused specifically on produced water, we're proposing literature published 2000 and on, one to represent most up-to-date technologies used to address issues of produced water being used in irrigation. It also represents about 90% of the literature published on produced water for irrigation. The Food Safety Panel thinks that we should be looking back to the beginning of time. We're happy to do that, but I'm not sure it's going to add substantively to our understanding. And then not really setting any date restrictions on the remainder, in part because I think there's going to be a lot of cases where we have very limited data, and I don't want to restrict a 1980 paper on one of the chemicals because that happens to be the only paper that's on it. For methods of oil and gas extraction, looking specifically at onshore conventional oil and gas. And then the location, we're going to focus, I guess, on North America. If it looks like there's sort of limited availability, we may expand that out. But I think that may be helpful, one, for the technologies that are used here, and the oil and gas production methods that are used. And then for the types of publication in hierarchical order, sort of how we're going to evaluate the utility of them, looking first at peer-reviewed literature, then government publications, scientific letters, and they may not be peer-reviewed, but they sometimes do report small bits of data that could be helpful, and industry reports. Are there any comments or questions on that? Or everyone's pretty good on there? Okay. And then so a quick update on task 3. As mentioned a little bit before, but this is sort of a overview of the sampling that has been conducted to date. X's represent data that have been collected, which we have in hand. So these are samples that have been sent off to the lab. We have lab reports in hand. Reports from 2016 and 2017 are currently online, and we're working on 2018, 2019. As mentioned earlier, cherries were just recently collected, and we're waiting on reports, hopefully in the next month or so. So to update on progress, our progress on task 3, we're currently working on drafting the report for all of 2018, 2019 data. Our initial review of the results suggests that there's no difference between the crops. Most of them find what we found previously, which is things like strontium, barium, copper. However, for the sake of transparency, I think it's important that the safety panel know about issues that we've had with the lab. So we have had some issues of getting reports out in a timely manner, which has sort of delayed us being able to draft these sampling reports. We've also QC'd all the reports after we received them and found a couple of issues that are now resolved. One of them was an issue of naphthalene contamination, and they falsely reported a quantified value when they shouldn't have. And the other was a false positive for 2-chloroethyl vinyl ether. Both of those, we went back to the lab, they reviewed their results, and those issues have been rectified. There's also been some holding time exceedances for grapes, lemons, and mandarins. 2018 for the grapes, 2019 for some of the sample of lemon mandarins. These were issues of equipment failure, and so samples had been shipped to the lab. The samples had been prepared so that they were homogenized or whatever they do, whether they be crushing them or sticking them into a blender. They were extracted out, stuck in the GCMS, and then the equipment malfunctioned, and they were unable to fix the equipment before the holding time of the extracted sample was analyzed. But we've reviewed those results, and when we compared them to results that did not have holding times exceeded, there don't appear to be any differences between the two. So with that, that sort of ends our update where we are on the scope of work for the MOU. If you have any questions, comments, in addition to those before.
Sorry, this is going back. I should have spoke up earlier. Slide 6, real quick. I had 2 questions. It said, now you've got a list of 62 chemicals for further evaluation, and those are based
those were these here. So those were the ones like the polymers, some of the surfactants that we don't have good toxicologic information on.
Gotcha.
That we're looking at potentially reviewing within the literature review.
Okay, so they're not part of the 122 and 51. They're
no.
Okay. Then again on 6. Oh, I know. The other thing, again, I think I mentioned this before, but using the existing water quality data as
Mhm.
well to, you
Yeah.
know, add to this.
Yep, noted.
Hey, Bernie, I have a question request. I think it was on slide 6.
Which we're there right now.
Oh, okay, we are there. Well, let's go to 7. It is on slide 7. You said the method of oil extraction, you were going to focus only on regarding onshore conventional oil and gas activities.
Yes.
I think it would be prudent to perhaps expand that a little bit to unconventional methods of oil extraction that are employed in Kern County.
Are you referring to hydraulic fracturing?
Yes.
Okay.
Just to look at it from a literature standpoint as to
Sure.
whether we should expect any differences, just from the standpoint that while right at this time we do not have any unconventional water being recycled, I envision the case in the future where somebody's going to come to us with water that they want to treat that's come from a hydraulically fractured field, or at least some wells within the field have been hydraulically fractured. And so I want us to think about that in the white paper that we put together as to what should the water boards do? Is that going to be a huge issue? And what should we do if that comes to pass? I don't want to leave that question completely unanswered. I don't know what the opinion of the panel is, but excluding that, I don't think is the right thing to do.
Sure. No, that sounds good.
So, to include that, I would think that, to include just the literature from that, sure, you can do that, but to actually go systematically through what that would mean, I would imagine that you would need to have a whole other chemical disclosure process, and a lot of that is already disclosed, so you could mine it. But I imagine that would, to say something substantive as opposed to just framey about that, I would assume that you'd have to actually go and get another list. If that's what you're suggesting. Or are you suggesting
one
just a
suggestion
frame?
might be is to see what the actual chemical differences are.
Can I just interject sort of quickly to sort of frame this, so we can maybe frame the discussion a little bit as far as the way the scope of work is framed, and then we maybe can move things back and forth. So there are sort of two separate things going on in the literature review. One is the review of these chemicals, and the other is the review of our understanding of produced water being used for agricultural irrigation. And so, I don't see there being any problem in basically expanding that first section, which is our understanding of just produced water and irrigation, looking at all sources or all methods of oil and gas production. I'm not sure it will impact the second half of that, which is looking at the chemicals that we already know are looked at right here. And as the lists expand, as our different wells are being used to provide irrigated water for production, the process can then be just sort of extended. These new chemicals can be slotted into the process that we've sort of developed here through the first two tasks, and then evaluate them as they come along. So I don't see that being a huge process, a huge issue there.
No, I don't see it as a huge issue. I just think that, when there's new fields with new processes and a different set of associated constituents, that seems like a new project. So.
No, I don't disagree with you, and I think there will be some ongoing work like like Bernie mentioned, because one of the questions that I want to have answered in the white paper is what happens if somebody uses a new chemical in the fields that has produced water? And is there a process do we go through to evaluate that? Because I don't expect it will always stay static. Or do we somehow work on a process that says nobody can use anything new? That's a difficult standard for us to enforce, much like Department of Public Health and CDFA have on the actual food safety issues that, you know, we need to have reasons for the actions that we take. So, you know, I would like to set up a process that says, you know, they use compound X that hasn't been used or reported before. Certainly it automatically goes into the water sampling, so we'll start to collect data about that. And we get updates on the chemicals regularly that are being used, and one of the big things is anything new being used? The next question says, if it's a new compound, after, you know, the food safety panel has completed its work, the white paper's done, I'd kind of like to set up the recommendations from the panel that says, okay, what do we do now? You know, is there a process that we should follow? Do we get like GSI to evaluate this and go through the process? Do we reconvene the panel? But that's kind of the question I have. I mean, not all those responses were great. I understand that, but I mean, I'm trying to be a little bit looking out into the future so that we don't get 6 months after we're done and the question's right back in front of us again.
I'm not a regulator, and I may not be fully up to speed on chemical policies and regulations that you need to adhere to in your decision making. But there are some bright and shiny examples of how to handle chemical use in oil and gas development when you're talking about a sensitive receptor or receptors. One of them is from the North Sea Pact. The countries that develop gas in the North Sea have to adhere to a certain list of acceptable chemicals that they're allowed to use. And they can't use other chemicals, especially, and if they want to use another chemical, they have to take it upon themselves to show that it meets a variety of, you know, characteristics. It's biodegradable, it's, you know, non-toxic, blah, blah, blah. Now that's specific to a marine ecosystem, and so that list of chemicals may be appropriate or may not be appropriate for the issue that we're talking about. But I don't know if that's out of scope for an American regulatory division or not. That's actually a question. I'm actually very interested in that.
Steve Beam, California Department of Food and Agriculture. I think it all depends upon the authorities available to the departments that we're talking about here, and not being entirely familiar with your authority, Clay, with the Regional Water Board or CDPH or us. I mean, we have certain things that we can require or can't require, and all comes down to what the legislature has granted us to be able to do or restrict. There are examples, and if legislation or existing authority would allow something like this, you could envision a model where you might have a list that you say is acceptable, as Seth was describing, but then you have a framework where it doesn't put the burden necessarily upon the regulatory agency to determine if it's safe. It puts the burden upon the user to determine it's safe before it's cleared. It's very similar to, say, a drug approval model, you know, where FDA has criteria for which they're going to evaluate a drug, but they're not going to do all the studies for you. They say, come to us with your data, and then we'll review it. So a similar model could be put into place, but it would have to be appropriate, of course, for the, the type of, process we're discussing here. I'm not saying that drugs and this are equivalent in terms of risk, but there are ways of approaching it, but it could require legislative change to get there eventually.
Well, I was going to reiterate this, basically the same thing, Dave, and say that, unfortunately, I don't have anybody here from the Office of Chief Counsel for the State Water Board. That really would come down to a legal question, as Stephen mentioned, I'm sure David would, is that we have specific regulatory areas and authorities, and some of the issues we're talking about are getting pretty close to the edge, if not over the edge. We don't advocate for legislative activity, but things like that may be appropriate to be handled by a different branch of the government.
Can I take a little bit of a tangential move question off of what we were just discussing there, which is going back a little bit to this task 2 and winnowing down this list more. Specifically, I asked about the polymers, and now I'm asking if anybody on the panel or would like to think about having a specific opinion on the applicability of using biodegradation tests results as a way to eliminate criteria chemicals as priorities. This is going towards OSPAR. There are standardized testing for biodegradation. They're typically in aqueous solutions. They're what they call die-away tests as you look at the degradation of the parent compound. And then based on various criteria that are written down about how quickly it goes away, the compound's categorized as readily biodegradable or easily biodegradable. And I personally would, having a lot of experience in this area of biodegradation and environmental fate of these chemicals, I think that's a good criteria that if you have those test results and the compound is easily biodegradable, that we can, in the absence of some other information, say that one's a lower priority than, say, a compound that is not easily biodegradable. And if we can have the panel sort of bless those types of decision criteria, then we can help winnow down these lists, which is really one of the major objectives of this task 1, task 2.
Hey, Will, excuse me for just a moment. We're getting a lot of noise over the phone. If somebody could go on mute, we would appreciate it very much. Thank you.
So I don't want to put people on the spot, but I think, as a panel, we need, as much as possible, if people can give us a definitive up or down on some of these criteria, where if you go back to your slide where you're doing your selection of the lists, at these decision points, we need to make sure everybody's on board, or as much as possible, get everybody on board. Like Seth mentioned some questions about grass. If I put in another line in there to say, hey, these are, were shown to be easily biodegradable based on the OECD die-away test. It's also US EPA test. Is that acceptable? That we can say that's at least a lower priority and doesn't need a full, soup to nuts environmental fate assessment.
So, well, Dave Mazzara, Public Health, it sounds like you kind of just answered this. How much is it going to be considerable amount of work? How would you describe the workload on that?
The workload's low because what we have is, what we've done a lot with these lists of chemicals works, mining databases and then, looking for tox data that was done by some other institution. And the same is for these standardized degradation tests. That data has already been collected. It's actually in the database mostly. I think it's really just a matter of saying this is an acceptable criteria.
I'm speaking for myself, not for the rest of the panel, but that kind of information for me is informative. as long as it's not a massive workload that requires a bunch of research and another contract, I mean, if that information can be gathered and compiled, I would find that useful.
If I told you that I thought the one that's more biodegradable is less of a problem in irrigation water than the one that's less biodegradable?
That would be useful information.
Okay.
Yeah, thought that was one of the ones that, criteria that were identified. So yeah, definitely.
And Will, you asked for a thumbs up or a thumbs down, and I'll give like a 5/6 of a thumbs up. As I mean, I'm a co-author of a number of papers that have basically winnowed away compounds using biodegradation criteria. So in general, I think it is very informative. The only reason why I'm not giving it 100%, I'm giving it like a 90%, is there's some papers out there on produced water quality that have looked at degradation of glutaraldehyde, for example. And glutaraldehyde is a very popularly used compound in oil and gas production, and it breaks down readily, but into daughter products, some of which are more toxic than glutaraldehyde and some that we don't have toxicity information. So I don't know exactly how to get rid of that problem. I think we should do the biodegradation screen, but I do think that we need to keep our eyes a little bit open for things like glutaraldehyde.
And just to explain a little bit, it's part of what, we did agree, we talked about the biodegradation process. Part of what, is going on between task 1 and task 2 is trying to just move things along. Is we started to have internal debates about where the cutoffs are, how we're going to handle this. And my opinion was move this thing forward. We take, like we were debating about exactly the kind of conversation Seth just had on, is this enough of a criteria or not? So we moved it forward with sticking to, toxicity, but also just to point out that this is an advancement because there's chronic, there's other criteria that are put in, plus, looking at grassless, plus we brought in all the natural compounds. So just part of the, it was a matter of let's move this thing forward. Let's get this task 1 list move forward. I'd like to winnow this down quite a bit more, but I really think we need to have this discussion, do it publicly, and not just let it be my call. And especially, as soon as we start to get resistance from any other experts saying, well, you need to explain this a little better, why we're doing this. That's why some of it just isn't done, because we just want to make sure everybody's on the same page.
If I can add to that too, I think we mentioned this in the report, is we know that there are specific factors in this, in the process of the water moving from being produced water to irrigation water to blended and then finally irrigated with it. So we know that biodegradation is very important. We know chemical hydrolysis is important. We know absorption to the soil is important. We know plant uptake and does it get distributed to an edible part of the plant is very important. What we don't have, and we kind of knew this going in, but it's been confirmed when I look at the literature, we really don't have firm biodegradation factors that we can use to say, okay, anything less than X is out. We're not going to look at it further. The same thing with absorption into soil. So my sense is that when we start to look at what's in the water, and we'll kind of work back to rationalize to say, well, why isn't this organic in the water? And say, oh, well, it's probably degraded. And when we look at things in crops, we'll say, well, we expect these probably absorbed to the soil and didn't get taken up. And then the plant uptake, we won't know if it's, if it's something that's soluble and is taken up in the plant. Well, why did it not end up in an edible portion? I doubt that we'll have literature for that, but we will identify all of those issues. And I don't think we're going to have, an algorithm where we can use a very precise cutoff for each of those chemical properties that will let us rationalize what is going to be in the plant or not. But all those factors will be taken into account, and I don't know exactly how they'll shake out, but they're all important.
Any other questions, comments? So I'd say stay tuned for task 2 on incorporating those factors and getting, let's get this list going and then we'll proceed.
Before we talk about, you going to talk about the fruit sampling? You did that also. Do we have any questions from members of the public? Seeing none, is there any from anybody on the phone? I think we have a couple emails.
We have a couple questions. The first one comes from Laura Hayter, and she says, if someone only eats food from a few poor traditional farmers who do not add phosphorus and selenium, etc., to their soil to reduce toxic metals, would they not be exposed to more toxic metals? Also, we need to educate farmers. Did you read this study linking strontium to autism? How significant are the results? And the study that she's talking about is Aurora et al., Fetal and Postnatal Metal Dysregulation in Autism, in Nature Communications, Volume 8. Okay. She also made a comment that barium was measured at up to 160 times the drinking water standard in 78% of fracking wastewater from Kern County. Ingesting high levels of barium over an extended period may increase blood pressure. And she cites the EPA's 2015 article about that. And then we have one last question from the email list. This is again from Justin Bass. This question is for the employee who works for CRC. His question is, approximately how much fresh water does CRC use for well stimulation or oil drilling annually? Please answer in gallons or barrels of fresh water. Thank you.
Well, I missed just a part of that because I was writing myself a note. I mean, certainly like the documents, that's the reason that the literature review is going to be done, is to look at issues like that, particularly for some of the metals that may be present in the oil-filled wastewater. So, but nobody in the room seemed to indicate that as of today they are familiar with that. I think there was also a comment about whether or not we're considering high barium that has been detected in hydraulically fractured wells. I can tell you at least, it's part of the reason why we're doing the water sampling is to know how much barium ends up in the water. But also, and part of that, what's the difference between wells that have been unconventionally drilled, like the fracked wells, versus the conventional drilling that has occurred in the areas where the water is being recycled? Just to clarify, at least in all of the water that is being produced now, we are not aware of any hydraulic fracturing activities that have occurred in those fields, and the geologic environment isn't suitable for hydraulic fracturing to occur. So those areas on the east side of the valley, we're not anticipating that hydraulic fracturing would be able to enhance oil production. So we don't see it as something that's probably going to happen. And I just wanted to point those things out. And I think we have a comment from the public also.
Hi, this is Brian Pellins with CRC, just to respond to the commenter. CRC is a net freshwater producer, but I'd be happy to get the information to the questioner directly if I could get their contact information. I can just look it up and pass it along.
Okay, or maybe you can give her you want to give her your email address or something, and she can send you a direct email? And that'll answer the freshwater question, because I don't have an answer for that question. Rebecca, any more?
That's it from the email.
Mr. Garabedian.
This is my first exposure to this, so a couple of quick comments that are basically a list, because we're talking about toxicity here, so maybe somebody else is looking into these issues, such as in terms of agricultural production or products, product quality, seed quality, tree health, vine health, the structure, soil productivity, long-term, immediate interaction with agricultural chemicals, and then the broader topics like tilling or odors, and then questions of runoff from the field, which I assume is being looked at somewhere by water board, or and things like that. My biochemistry, my plant physiology course was in 1967, so a few years ago I had some cause to look into some issues within the last 10 years, and all I could remember at first was the Krebs cycle, but I very quickly got into biochemistry, found that this whole field has emerged in the plant biochemistry, and many issues around that, including polymers and the things I just mentioned. So it seems to me a lot of the topics you're talking about right now need that kind of information and knowledge by you.
Thank you.
So there's a lot of hi, I'm David Braun again here. There's a lot of discussion about a good many things, and I just want to thank everyone for engaging in this process and allowing this public comment and these questions. I have a question for the California Department of Public Health, and I guess in question about or conversation about the polymers, and I guess some of these chemical constituents we're not able to identify the deleterious effects on the body. Now, how are we able to identify whether these chemicals are bad for us or not? Is this kind of EPA standards? And I guess the follow-up to that is, as new chemicals come out, do we have faith in the current, and no offense to the gentleman on the panel, but we've clearly seen a pattern in the past 3 years of chemicals that were found to be toxic, unacceptable for use, for instance, in agriculture, now are actually being used, and we've actually seen there be health impacts for these things. How confident can we be in the existing standard as new chemicals are identified that we're actually getting accurate information here in the state of California that actually does really prioritize these sorts of things?
Well, thank you for your question. Again, this is Dave Mazzara. I'm with the Department of Public Health. We oversee all the food manufacturers in the state. We work with CDFA closely as partners because they do most of the agricultural work and oversight in the state. So you asked some pretty big questions that are not easy to answer. There's a lot of unknowns in that whole area of unknown chemicals, emerging chemicals. So let me see if I can parse this out in a way that makes sense, at least to me and hopefully to you. There's chemicals that we know about, and those primarily have standards that have been set by some agency or organization, whether it be ours, Department of Public Health, or someone else. They can be a federal agency, they can be another state agency like Department of Pesticide Regulation or OEHA, Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Our other partners, they usually set some type of standard that we will then use as the level that can't be exceeded in commodities that we regulate. And we rely on those organizations as well as our own to do some type of either sampling, or some type of surveillance of different commodities. Many departments have that function and serve that function where they're out there doing some kind of survey of those commodities that they oversee, and then they test and compare those against known standards. Confidence in that is pretty high because there's been a lot of money and time and data generated that goes into generating those standards. There's a whole process for putting those standards through a peer review process, public comment period, and then those get promulgated and then used by regulatory agencies. So the confidence of this is fairly high. Now remember that those standards change over time. There's usually processes in place for those agencies that are required to review those standards. New information emerges, they gather that information, they do additional testing, they re-review those standards, and then they evaluate whether or not they need to change the standard. So that's a pretty standard process that's gone on for a very, very long time in this. So the confidence in that is fairly high. I think where the issue is these unknown chemicals, these unknown standards that we talked a little bit about today. That's kind of why we're here for this particular group, is we're not exactly sure what we're dealing with and what that means in terms of public health impact. And so we have, for example, our department has statutory language that allows us to, when there's an emerging standard emerging issue that we're aware of, a chemical that's a problem that we deem deleterious to public health or to pose a public health risk, we can do something about that. Probably through promulgating through a regulatory process, so doing a regulation or rulemaking, we can set a new standard. But that requires that we have data that's been substantiated, has gone through some kind of peer review process that allows us to do something with that chemical and then hopefully mitigate the risk to public health. But it's those unknown chemicals, and that's why this panel is here. There's many other panels like this that have been out there. You've heard panel members talking about emerging chemicals of concerns in other agencies. They're looking at this problem in drinking water, in the air, like you mentioned earlier. That is the challenge that we're dealing with, is trying to figure out how those chemicals may or may not impact health and what the risk is of those. I can't answer definitively one way or the other how the best, I don't know how to tell you how that's done effectively. We just have to work our way through these processes, these panels, and folks like yourself, and see what we can come up with that makes sense.
And so, without information about the chemicals, so the chemicals could be deleterious and we don't know it because we haven't been able to identify them. Is that possible?
I think that's exactly what we're talking about.
And so we'll continue allowing the process without knowing.
Or you could think of that on the reverse side. How do we know if we don't know what we don't know, how do we know what to do? We can't regulate.
Would you keep ingesting it yourself if you didn't know?
I would.
You would?
I wouldn't know because I wouldn't ingest it because I wouldn't know. I mean,
Right.
you can't, that is not a logical, I don't know how to answer that question because there's really no risk to evaluate. An unknown is an unknown.
An unknown is an unknown. Okay.
I'd like to add a little bit to this. For example, in drinking water, this has an analogy to developing drinking water standards. When we do drinking water standards, we start off with a list of things that we are worried about. They might be a problem, they might not, but let's take a look. It's called the contaminant candidate list. You start with that. And then we have to take a look at, well, does it actually occur in drinking water? So you have to get that information. And then we have to see whether we know anything about the toxicity. And you got to have the occurrence and the toxicity before you go forward, because that's just the nature of the statutory requirements for setting a drinking water standard. And it's true for lots of other things, as Dave already was mentioning. So you have to, if you don't know the toxicity, you can't really go forward. We have a lot of things still on that contaminant candidate list that the work groups that are assigned to try and set standards, you can't go anywhere with. And it's the same thing with occurrence. Now what we're doing here is making that laundry list. That's the task one, is the full list of things that we worry about that could be in the produced water that could conceivably go from produced water to irrigation, to soil, to plant, to fruit, to you. And you take a look at that. And then we'll have to make a judgment as to, and that's task 2, is what is likely actually to get to you. And then we're going to have to look at the toxicity at the same time, kind of in parallel. Well, if we don't know the toxicity, we're really not going to be able to do anything about that. I mean, it's not to say that it couldn't stay, and it should stay a worry. We just can't do anything about it because we don't know. It'll be up for the panel to make a determination as to, okay, well, what do we do about that when we don't know the toxicity? Lots of things we don't know the toxicity, they don't turn out to be toxic. And some of these polymers and things are probably not, even if they were toxic, they're probably not going to get into what we eat. So I just wanted to bring that out. If that helps clarify it a little bit more, there are going to be dilemmas that this panel is going to have to face in terms of what we recommend, because we make recommendations ultimately.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, and that definitely helps. And I guess I'm having a hard time understanding, like, for instance, if there's these standards for I think you mentioned something about the North Sea, and that the chemicals have to be approved or identified or approved before they can actually be used, right? And that's in I guess, a sensitive ecosystem. I don't know any more sensitive ecosystem than where our food is being produced, and it's deeply disconcerting that we don't have that kind of process around this issue, but we have it for the North Sea, where it sounds like it's just a sensitive ecosystem. So that's really disconcerting that we're not actually approaching this process with some sort of precautionary principle, high standard when our food is concerned. Also, I think, Bill, you had mentioned something about soil samples, and I think, yes, soil samples are good, but the water really, I mean, I'm a gardener, and I'm not, I remember the 70s, we were recycling our water, and I've been a Californian all my life, and, we had a redwood tub that we'd take our water out from our washing machines, right, and we'd use that, but we weren't using that on our garden, because we knew that it wasn't clean water. So for me, the idea of putting anything on our water that may have that we're not testing religiously, and which brings me to actually one more question. That there is I think there is a discussion about random sampling, and so I'm very curious is there random sampling currently going on with this process with the water?
No, it's periodic.
Periodic. Is that like every day, or is it?
It's quarterly.
Quarterly?
Four times a year.
And who's taking those samples?
That's as often as any drinking water is tested.
And I should add that's done at numerous locations.
Quarterly. Who's taking these samples?
The samples are collected by this is the standard process for the water boards. The samples are collected by the discharger. They pay for the
so the industry.
analyses. And they're done by the industry, and then they submit the results to us under penalty of perjury that what they've done is correct and
no one's ever seen a corporation lie before under oath, right? Is there any independent testing going on?
The water boards have a small amount of money available to do independent sampling, and we sometimes take splits as quality control.
Split, okay.
Yeah, where we have their samplers collect the same set of samples. And I had staff at a different facility yesterday, not a facility associated with produced water, doing that exactly.
Great.
As
Very
a
good.
check, but unfortunately, I don't have the resources to be able to do that very often.
Well, I would hope that we would be able to find the money somewhere to ensure that public health is being protected and that we would prioritize that. There is I think, $16 billion surplus within the state of California. Perhaps we could ask the governor and the legislature to assign a little bit more money to protect public health. But it's deeply alarming that there is not an independent water sampling, random sample happening of the water. Again, you know, in my garden, I use the clean water on my food. That's what I do for my food, and I think, at least with the Department of Public Health, I have deep concerns that, I mean, I'm looking to the Department of Public Health to make sure that my food's safe. There's not random sampling going on, and the sampling that is going on is being taken by Chevron. Is that right?
By the discharger, which Chevron is responsible for some of the area. For the sampling, it's actually, you know, for the big one that Chevron discharges to, it's Coelho Water District, because they're the ones that receive and distribute the water, and they actually produce the reports and certify the reports.
Who sits on the board for the Coelho Water District?
The general manager is sitting just behind you, a
Right.
couple rows.
And the board members?
I do not know who all the board members are.
Well, I think that it would probably be in the, I mean, just as far as, you know, Chevron, I would imagine they would want everybody to feel good about the testing process as well. I mean, we're all wanting to feel good about this. And I think if the public is feeling good about it, Chevron would probably feel good about it too. So I don't see that there's any downside to having independent random testing of the water. I think the water is the key thing. This isn't like water that we're taking and we're putting on the side of the road to irrigate, brush or whatever it is. This is stuff that we're putting into our bodies. We should be absolutely certain that the water, which is what we're talking about, not the crop specifically, or I mean the soil, these are things that we should know when evaluating this process, but we are talking about the water. We should know what's in the water and be able to do random sampling, especially if we're deciding whether this is a safe process for human consumption. So I would encourage us to, or I would encourage this process to start to embrace this, especially if the Department of Public Health is going to sign off on this. We would need some more independent testing rather than the testing that's being done by the suppliers themselves. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any other comments on this item? Any on the phone or by email? Seeing that, we'll move on to agenda item 5, which is any other general comments by the public or the panel regarding the issues associated with this project.
Bill Alio, Environmental Working Group. One quickie is that our concern about buildup in the soil isn't just that food grown in that soil could be more likely to uptake elements. It's that when you work that soil, dust is airborne, and that workers could be inhaling it. And there are known problems with inhaling things that are in dust. So that's why we want to know, boy, we're getting a lot of X and Y building up here. Is it being airborne? And therefore farm workers who are out there on a frequent basis could be inhaling it and subject to some health threat. So that was another thing behind soil testing. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? Seeing no general comments, Rebecca, RJ, what do we have for action items? Do we have any action items from the meeting today?
Yeah, we have a few. So the first one is the panel should submit comments on the meeting summary from the last public meeting within a week, which is May 17th. The second action item is GSI is working on comments submitted on the report for task 1 by the panel. I don't know if you wanted to set a date for or a deadline for that. Moving on to the third action item, GSI will look into unconventional methods of stimulation. And the last one that I picked out was from the conversations that you all were having was the panel to consider how the water board would handle new chemicals used in the oil fields. And this is for the white paper recommendation section.
Thank you. I also want to add that for the next public meeting, we're going to start, staff at the Water Board is going to start vigorously assembling parts of the white paper and getting that, because as we get through this process, I think it's about time that we start to formulate our results as GSI is getting through their task, and we have the results back from the fruit sampling that we'll do with this part of the project anyway, is that, we're going to go ahead and start putting that together, start having some regular conversations with panel members, both in public and perhaps not in public, regarding putting this together, what we want to include, and starting to get a draft that the Water Board staff can put together and start having more detailed input from the panel as we get through this process. Because as I mentioned earlier, I would like to have, my goal is to have a draft of this report to the panel members before the first of the calendar year. That's only 7.5 months from now, and while that seems like a while, I'm sure that's going to go very quickly. So I just want to say that will start to become a significant portion of the agendas as we move forward. If nobody else has any questions or any comments, I think we've come to the end of the agenda. I want to thank everybody for participating, both the panel members who volunteer their time, and to all the members of the public for coming and spending your time. This is an issue that's critical to the water boards. We're not the agency responsible for food safety, but we do permit this. Our normal authority is in areas associated with water quality, but we do want to work with our sister agencies because we are concerned that the food we consume is safe, and we want to make sure that the public can feel the same. Rebecca?
Sorry to interrupt, Clay. I got one more question on the email list. This again comes from Justin Bass. He has 2 questions. The first one, will there be labeling on food grown with oil field produced water? And then his second question is, will there be epidemiology studies of people who eat food grown with oil field produced water?
At this time, I believe the answer, if there was to be food labeling, that's outside the purview of the water board, so I can't answer that. And as would be epidemiological studies on people, that's outside the purview of the water boards.
Clay, can I add a couple of things to that? So on the first question, food labeling requires either regulation or statutory changes. So there's not going to be anything at this point. Can't say that there wouldn't be in the future if that's something that either comes out of this panel or if through some other process. But there's nothing at this point to do that gives anyone authority to do that, either at the state level or at the federal level. And Steve, if you have anything to add to that. In terms of epidemiology, the Department of Public Health does have a group that does epidemiological studies on environmental health issues, but that generally requires there to be an issue identified that they can then do research on and go do those studies on. So there are resources at the state level in our department to do that. Again, it requires a process and someone to identify an actual problem, but then they would begin to investigate and do that epidemiological research and investigation on. So it's possible, should one identify a problem that would need investigation.
Bill Alio, Environmental Working Group, maybe a little bit tangential response to the person who's emailing in is that one group of interested parties in this has been the organic food growers in Kern County who've watched this area closely because they're worried about could they be decertified as organic if something shows up in their food. I don't think they're doing their own testing, but I know they're keenly aware of all the monitoring that's going on now, and to me, they're kind of the first line of, I won't say defense, but the first people who would be, raising their hand if they say this could allow them to be decertified. It's a hugely growing business in this state, and their profit, their reputation is based on not having contaminants that are inorganic or coming from an oil field. So let's keep our eye on the organic growers too, as I think they're bird dogging this process. Thanks.
Any other questions or comments?
No.
Seeing that, again, I'll thank everybody for participating. Appreciate you investing your time. We'll be back in about 3 months for another public meeting. Thank you very much. Bye.